Dawn broke cold over the mountains of Tuscany on April 21st, 1945, the kind of morning where mist clung to the valleys like smoke, where every breath came sharp and visible in the thin mountain air. Second Lieutenant Daniel Inouye stood with his platoon on a rocky slope, looking up at what the Germans called the Gotenstellung. The Allies knew it simply as the Gothic Line, and it was about to become the scene of something that would defy every reasonable expectation of what a human being could endure. The Gothic Line wasn't just a defensive position. It was Germany's last desperate attempt to hold Italy, a belt of fortifications that stretched 320 kilometers across the spine of the Apennine Mountains. From the Tyrrhenian Sea near La Spezia to the Adriatic coast at Pesaro, the Germans had spent months transforming these mountains into a fortress. More than 2,000 machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire, nearly 500 gun positions, thousands upon thousands of meters of barbed wire, anti-tank ditches carved into solid rock, concrete bunkers reinforced to withstand direct artillery hits. The mountains themselves became weapons, their steep slopes and narrow valleys turning every advance into a nightmare of exposure and vulnerability. Inouye's objective that morning was a heavily defended ridge near the village of San Terenzo, a critical strongpoint along the Gothic Line. His platoon of 30 men from Company E of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team had been tasked with taking this ridge as part of the larger spring offensive aimed at finally breaking through Germany's last major defensive line in Italy. For 2 days, they had been working their way up through terrain that seemed designed specifically to kill anyone foolish enough to attack it. The ridge rose before them like a natural fortress, its slopes littered with rocks that could hide 100 enemy soldiers. Somewhere up there, embedded in bunkers and rock formations, German troops waited with MG-42 machine guns, weapons that could fire 1,200 rounds per minute and turn any open ground into an instant killing field. The German defenders knew every inch of this ground. They had spent months preparing it, understanding that when the Americans finally came, geography itself would fight on their side. Inouye studied the ridge through binoculars, noting the likely positions of enemy emplacements. At 20 years old, he had already seen more combat than most soldiers experience in an entire war. He had fought through the mountains of Italy, survived the rescue of the lost battalion in France, where his unit had suffered devastating casualties to save a surrounded Texas battalion, and earned a battlefield commission for his actions. He carried a Thompson submachine gun, its weight familiar in his hands, and in his shirt pocket he no longer carried the 2 silver dollars that had once stopped a German bullet aimed at his heart. He had lost those coins a few days earlier, a fact that nagged at the back of his mind with the peculiar superstition that combat soldiers develop. But there was something else that made this morning different, something that elevated the stakes beyond simple military objectives. Daniel Inouye was a Nisei, a second-generation Japanese-American, and every man in his platoon was the same. They were fighting for a country that had imprisoned their families, declared them enemy aliens, stripped them of their rights and dignity. While Inouye and his men crawled up Italian mountainsides to fight Germans, their parents and siblings sat behind barbed wire in American concentration camps in the deserts of the western United States. This wasn't just a battle for a ridge in Italy. It was a battle to prove their loyalty, their worth, their right to call themselves Americans. The attack began at dawn with an artillery barrage that sent shells screaming over their heads to impact on the ridge above. Then Inouye gave the signal, and his platoon moved forward in a swift, enveloping movement, using every scrap of cover the broken terrain provided. They made good progress initially, the German defenders apparently stunned by the speed and aggression of the American advance. Within the first hour, Inouye's platoon had captured an enemy artillery and mortar position and brought his men to within 40 yards of the main German defensive line. That's when the killing ground opened up. 3 German machine guns, positioned in bunkers and rock formations with perfect interlocking fields of fire, suddenly roared to life. The sound of an MG-42 at full rate of fire is distinctive, a buzzsaw scream that tells experienced soldiers they have about 2 seconds to find cover or die. Inouye's men hit the ground, pressing themselves into whatever depressions and rocks they could find, but the position was impossible. They were pinned down on open ground with nowhere to go. Every attempt to move drew immediate fire that chipped rock and sent ricochets whining into the morning air. Inouye understood the tactical situation immediately. His platoon was trapped. They couldn't advance, couldn't effectively retreat, and staying where they were meant the Germans would simply call in mortar fire and massacre them at leisure. Someone had to silence those machine guns, and someone had to do it now. He began to crawl forward, moving with the careful precision of a man who knows that the slightest mistake means death. The slope offered minimal cover, just rocks and scraggly vegetation that wouldn't stop a bullet but might hide his movement. His Thompson was slung across his back, grenades hung from his webbing. 5 yards, 10 yards. The nearest machine gun nest was only a few meters ahead now, so close he could hear the German gunners calling to each other over the sound of their weapon. Then Inouye stood up. In one fluid motion, he rose to his full height, pulled a grenade from his belt, yanked the pin, and hurled it toward the machine gun nest. Before the Germans could react, he had thrown a second grenade. Both grenades found their mark, detonating inside the confined space of the bunker with devastating effect. The machine gun fell silent, but in the seconds that Inouye stood exposed, a German soldier in another position had lined up his shot. The rifle cracked, and Inouye felt a massive impact in his stomach, the kind of blow that drives all the air from your lungs and sends shock waves of pain radiating through your entire body. He looked down and saw blood spreading across his uniform, a wound that should have ended the battle for him right then and there. Instead, Inouye unslung his Thompson submachine gun and, one-handed, fired into the captured machine gun position to make sure no German soldiers remained alive to threaten his platoon. The .45 caliber rounds from the Thompson hit with massive stopping power at close range, designed to put down targets immediately. Satisfied that the first position was neutralized, Inouye turned his attention to the second machine gun nest. His men shouted at him to fall back, to get medical attention, that he had done enough. Inouye ignored them. He understood something that perhaps they didn't, not yet. The only way his platoon survived this day was if those machine guns were silenced, and right now he was the only one in position to do it. The stomach wound bled freely, and he could feel his strength beginning to fade, but adrenaline and sheer willpower kept him moving. The second machine gun nest was positioned to cover the approach to the first, a textbook defensive setup that created overlapping fields of fire. Inouye knew that attacking it would mean exposing himself to whatever German soldiers remained in the third position. But there was no other choice. He rallied his men with hand signals, directing their covering fire, and then began his second assault. This attack followed the same pattern as the first, a careful, agonizing crawl toward the enemy position while machine gun fire kicked up rocks and dirt around him. Then the sudden explosion of action as he stood, grenades already in hand, throwing them with precision born of countless hours of training. The second machine gun nest erupted in smoke and flame, its crew killed or wounded by the fragmentation grenades. But the effort of this second assault, combined with blood loss from his stomach wound, finally overwhelmed even Inouye's extraordinary willpower. His vision began to tunnel. His legs felt distant and weak. He collapsed, his body finally responding to the massive trauma it had sustained. His men thought it was over, that their lieutenant had finally reached his limit. They were wrong. As Inouye lay on the rocky ground trying to gather strength, he could see the third machine gun nest. It was positioned about 10 yards away, its crew probably confused about whether the Americans were still attacking or had been repulsed. That third machine gun was the key to everything. If it remained operational, it could still slaughter his platoon. If it could be silenced, the ridge would fall. Inouye began to crawl again, not a tactical crawl with a weapon ready, but the desperate movement of a severely wounded man refusing to quit. Inch by painful inch, using his elbows to drag himself forward while blood continued to seep from his stomach wound. His men watched in horror and awe, some of them crying, as their lieutenant pulled himself across broken ground toward an enemy position that could kill him at any moment. 10 yards became 5. 5 yards became 3. Inouye gathered himself for one final assault. He pulled a grenade from his web gear, yanked the pin with his teeth, and prepared to throw. As he raised himself up, cocking his arm back for the throw, a German soldier inside the third bunker fired a Schiessbecher rifle grenade, a specialized anti-personnel weapon designed for exactly this kind of close-range defense. The grenade struck Daniel Inouye's right elbow with tremendous force. It failed to detonate, but the blunt trauma was catastrophic. The impact essentially severed his right arm at the elbow, leaving it attached by only a few strips of tissue and skin. The limb hung useless, nerve endings screaming in agony, blood pumping from severed arteries. And still clutched in Inouye's dead right hand was the live grenade, its fuse burning down seconds from explosion. Most men would have simply died at this point, either from shock, blood loss, or the grenade detonating. Daniel Inouye looked down at his severed arm, at the grenade it still held, and made a decision that defined the rest of his life. With his left hand, he pried the grenade from the fingers of his dead right arm. The fuse was still burning. He had perhaps 2 seconds before it detonated. Without hesitation, without time for thought or fear, he threw the grenade left-handed into the third machine gun nest. The explosion killed the German crew inside, but Daniel Inouye wasn't finished. He picked up his Thompson submachine gun, braced it against his hip with his one good arm, and began firing at the remaining German positions on the ridge. 45 caliber rounds sprayed across the German defensive line as Inouye, his right arm hanging useless and shredded, his stomach leaking blood, advanced up the ridge while firing one-handed. A German soldier shot him in the leg. Inouye kept firing. Finally, as his platoon swept forward to secure the ridge, Daniel Inouye lost consciousness from blood loss and shock. His men rushed to his side, applying tourniquets and pressure bandages, screaming for a medic. In the attack, his platoon had killed 25 German soldiers and captured 8 more. 3 machine gun nests had been destroyed. The ridge was taken, and Second Lieutenant Daniel Inouye was still impossibly alive. The cost of survival would be high. 20 months of rehabilitation lay ahead. His right arm was amputated at a field hospital. His dreams of becoming a surgeon died with that arm. But the man who had crawled up that Italian ridge with grenades and a Thompson submachine gun, who had refused to stop even when his own body betrayed him, that man had proven something that no amount of political rhetoric could match. To understand the full weight of what Daniel Inouye did on that April morning in 1945, you have to understand where he came from and what he was fighting for. Not just the immediate tactical objective of taking a ridge in Italy, but the larger battle to prove that Japanese Americans deserve to be called Americans at all. Daniel Ken Inouye was born on September 7, 1924, in Honolulu, Territory of Hawaii. His grandparents had immigrated from Fukuoka Prefecture in Japan, part of the wave of Japanese immigration to Hawaii in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His father worked multiple jobs to support the family. Daniel grew up in the Mo'ili'ili neighborhood, a predominantly Japanese-American community where the values of both cultures blended into something uniquely Hawaiian. He was 17 years old on December 7, 1941, a Sunday morning he would remember for the rest of his life. Inouye was getting ready for church when he heard aircraft engines overhead, unusually low and loud. Then came the explosions, rolling thunder that shook the entire island. He ran outside and saw smoke rising from Pearl Harbor, saw aircraft with the rising sun insignia strafing and bombing the American naval base. As a Red Cross volunteer, Inouye spent that day treating wounded soldiers and civilians, seeing firsthand the devastation the Japanese attack had caused. That experience crystallized something in him. This was his country under attack. These were his people bleeding and dying. He was American, and America needed defending. But America didn't see it that way. Not at first. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The order authorized the Secretary of War to designate military areas from which any persons could be excluded for any reason, essentially for military necessity. The language of the order was careful, not specifying any particular ethnic group. But everyone knew who it targeted. Within weeks, military commanders on the West Coast began issuing exclusion orders specifically aimed at people of Japanese ancestry. It didn't matter if you were a citizen born in America. It didn't matter if you had never been to Japan, didn't speak Japanese, had no connection to the Japanese government whatsoever. If you had Japanese blood, you were suspect. You were potentially dangerous. You were, in the language of the day, an enemy alien. 120,000 Japanese Americans were rounded up and sent to what the government euphemistically called relocation centers. In reality, they were concentration camps, surrounded by barbed wire, patrolled by armed guards, located in some of the most desolate and inhospitable regions of the American interior. The Manzanar camp sat in the scorching desert of California's Owens Valley. Minidoka Camp occupied the sagebrush plains of Idaho. Hart Mountain Camp endured the brutal winters of Wyoming. Families were given just days, sometimes just hours, to dispose of everything they owned, sell businesses and property for pennies on the dollar, pack whatever they could carry, and report for transportation to the camps. The living conditions in these camps were deliberately harsh. Families lived in single rooms in tar paper barracks with no insulation and minimal furniture. They shared communal bathrooms and mess halls with hundreds of other internees. The camps were located in places with extreme temperatures, blazing hot in summer and freezing cold in winter. There was no privacy, no dignity, and worst of all, no clear end date. The government could hold you indefinitely, without charges, without trial, without any legal recourse whatsoever. Think about that for a moment. American citizens, many of them born and raised in the United States, stripped of their rights and imprisoned by their own government solely because of their ethnic heritage. At the same time, German Americans and Italian Americans, whose ancestral countries were also at war with the United States, faced no such mass incarceration. The racism at the heart of Executive Order 9066 was undeniable. Daniel Inouye was spared this fate only because he lived in Hawaii, where the Japanese American population was so large and so integrated into the economy that mass incarceration would have been impractical. But the military still declared all Japanese Americans in Hawaii to be enemy aliens, changing their draft status to 4C, the classification for those considered unfit for military service due to being enemy aliens. Young Japanese American men training in ROTC programs were immediately discharged. The message was clear. You are not Americans. You cannot be trusted. You are the enemy. The injustice of this situation cut deep into the Japanese American community. Here were people who considered themselves Americans, who had built lives and businesses in America, whose children were born with American citizenship, suddenly told they were foreigners, threats, unworthy of the basic rights that Constitution promised. And yet, rather than turn away from America, rather than embrace bitterness and resentment, many young Japanese American men made a different choice. They volunteered to serve anyway. When the War Department announced in early 1943 that it would form a segregated all-Japanese American combat unit, the response stunned military planners. They had hoped for 1,500 volunteers from Hawaii. More than 10,000 men stepped forward. On the mainland, where the majority of Japanese Americans were imprisoned in camps, the response was more mixed. Only about 1,200 men volunteered from the camps, a hesitation born of the profound injustice of being asked to fight for a country that had imprisoned your family. But even 1,200 men volunteering from behind barbed wire represented an extraordinary act of faith and loyalty. These volunteers formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, activated on February 1, 1943, at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. They chose as their motto 3 words that encapsulated their determination: go for broke. It was a gambling term from Hawaii, meaning to risk everything on a single all-out effort. These men were going to stake everything, their lives, their futures, everything they had, on proving that Japanese Americans were as American as anyone else. The training at Camp Shelby was brutal. The 442nd trained alongside other Army units, but they trained harder, pushed themselves further, determined to prove they were the equal of any soldiers in the Army. White officers commanded the regiment, but most of the line officers and all of the enlisted men were Nisei, Japanese Americans. They came from different backgrounds. The Hawaiian contingent, about 2/3 of the unit, were generally more outgoing and confident. The mainland volunteers, many coming straight from the camps, were often more reserved, carrying the psychological scars of incarceration. But in training, these differences melted away. They became a unit, bound together by their common heritage and their common determination to prove something to America. They mastered infantry tactics, weapons training, physical conditioning. They learned to work together as fire teams, squads, platoons, companies, and they waited for their chance to prove themselves in combat. That chance came in June 1944, when the 442nd deployed to Italy. By this time, Allied forces had been fighting their way up the Italian peninsula for nearly a year, facing determined German resistance at every defensive line. The Germans had turned Italy's mountainous terrain into a fortress in depth, with each mountain range presenting a new line of fortifications that had to be assaulted and taken at terrible cost. The 442nd joined the fighting in the Rome-Arno campaign, their first taste of real combat. They learned quickly that training, no matter how realistic, couldn't fully prepare you for the reality of men trying to kill you. They learned about the fear that makes your hands shake when you reload, the exhaustion of marching for days with full packs through mountains, the grief of watching friends die. And they learned that they could fight, could advance under fire, could take objectives and hold ground, as well as any unit in the Army. But their defining moment came in France, in the Vosges Mountains, in October 1944. The Allied advance through France had pushed deep into the Vosges forest, a region of steep ridges covered in dense timber, where visibility was measured in yards and every hilltop was another German defensive position. The American command had sent the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, a Texas unit, on an aggressive push into German-held territory. The attack stalled, and worse, German forces surrounded the Texas Battalion, cutting them off from resupply and reinforcement. More than 200 men were trapped behind enemy lines with dwindling ammunition and food, under constant German attack. They became known as the Lost Battalion. The 442nd was ordered to rescue them. The Nisei soldiers understood the bitter irony of the situation. They were being sent to save a Texas unit, soldiers from a state where many of their families couldn't even vote or own property because of their race. But orders were orders, and the Lost Battalion needed rescuing. The rescue operation became a 6-day nightmare of close-quarters forest combat in cold rain. The Germans had prepared the ground well, with machine gun nests covering every approach, with mortars pre-registered on likely attack routes, with infantry dug into positions that had to be rooted out one foxhole at a time. The 442nd attacked day after day, taking brutal casualties, advancing yard by bloody yard through terrain that favored the defenders in every way. Daniel Inouye distinguished himself in this fighting. As a sergeant, he led his squad through assault after assault, learning the brutal arithmetic of infantry combat, where every objective costs lives. He saw friends die beside him, saw the devastating effects of German machine gun and mortar fire on exposed soldiers, and he kept leading his men forward. When the 442nd finally broke through to the lost battalion on October 30th, they had suffered more than 800 casualties to rescue 211 men. Some companies in the regiment had been reduced to less than 24 men fit for duty from their original strength of over 150. It was a Pyrrhic victory, the kind where success feels more like survival than triumph. But for the military leadership, it proved something crucial. The 442nd could fight. They had courage, determination, tactical skill, and a willingness to pay whatever price was necessary to accomplish their mission. Daniel Inouye received a battlefield commission, becoming Second Lieutenant Inouye in recognition of his leadership and bravery. At 20 years old, he was one of the youngest officers in the regiment. After the Vosges, the 442nd was pulled back for rest and refitting. They spent several months guarding the French-Italian border near Nice, a relatively quiet assignment that gave them time to absorb replacements and recover from the brutal fighting in France. But the rest couldn't last. In early 1945, they were called back to Italy for the spring offensive against the Gothic Line. The Gothic Line represented Germany's last desperate attempt to hold Italy. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, had spent the fall and winter of 1944 preparing these defenses. He knew that if the Gothic Line fell, the Allies would break out into the Po Valley, the broad plain of northern Italy, where their superior numbers and mechanized forces would overwhelm his depleted armies. Holding the mountains was Germany's only chance. The fortifications were staggering in scope. German engineers, aided by forced labor from Italian civilians, had spent months turning the Apennine Mountains into a killing ground. They had carved machine gun positions into solid rock, positioned so that each gun covered the approaches to its neighbors. They had built concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire. They had strung thousands of meters of barbed wire across every likely approach. They had planted anti-tank mines and anti-personnel mines in carefully recorded patterns. They had dug anti-tank ditches across roads and mountain passes. They had positioned mortars and artillery pieces to cover every valley and ridge with pre-registered fire. The Germans called it the Gotenstellung, the Gothic position, a name chosen to evoke the ancient Gothic tribes who had once defended against Roman invasions. Hitler himself had worried the name was too impressive, that if the Allies broke through, they could claim to have breached the mighty Gothic Line. So he ordered it renamed the Green Line, the Grüne Linie. But soldiers on both sides kept calling it the Gothic Line, recognizing it for what it was, the last major defensive position between the Allies and victory in Italy. Breaking the Gothic Line would require everything the Allied armies could muster: artillery barrages that turned mountainsides to moonscapes, airstrikes that hammered German positions day after day, and infantry, always infantry, soldiers who would have to cross open ground under fire, who would have to climb steep slopes while machine guns tried to kill them, who would have to assault bunkers and clear trenches in close quarters, fighting where courage and luck mattered as much as skill. The 442nd drew one of the toughest assignments. They were tasked with taking a series of ridges near San Terenzo in Tuscany, positions that anchored a critical section of the Gothic Line. These weren't just geographic features, they were fortresses, each ridge a carefully prepared defensive position that the Germans intended to defend to the last man. The offensive began on April 19, 1945, with massive artillery barrages and airstrikes. For 2 days, the 442nd fought their way forward, taking objectives at heavy cost. By April 21st, they had reached the most difficult positions, the ridge complexes that formed the backbone of the German defense in this sector. This was the situation that brought 2nd Lieutenant Daniel Inouye and his platoon to that ridge near San Terenzo on the morning of April 21st. Everything that had come before, all the training, all the previous combat, all the determination to prove Japanese-American loyalty, all of it came down to what happened next. And what happened next became the stuff of legend. When the medics finally reached Inouye, they found him barely conscious, his right arm a shredded mess, his stomach wound still bleeding, a fresh wound in his leg. They worked frantically to stabilize him, applying tourniquets and pressure bandages, pumping him full of morphine for the pain. They loaded him onto a stretcher and carried him down the mountain to a field hospital, fully expecting him to die en route. But Daniel Inouye didn't die. He held on through the evacuation, through emergency surgery at the field hospital, through transport to a better-equipped medical facility. The doctors amputated his right arm at the elbow, cleaned and closed his stomach wound, treated the leg injury. For days, he hovered between life and death as infection and shock threatened to finish what German bullets and grenades had started. Slowly, impossibly, he began to recover. The wounds healed, his strength returned, but the right arm was gone forever, and with it, his dreams of becoming a surgeon. Before the war, Inouye had planned to attend medical school. Now, that future was impossible. He would have to find a new path forward. The Army initially awarded Inouye the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second-highest military decoration. The citation detailed his extraordinary heroism on that April day. The 3 machine gun nests destroyed, the 25 enemy soldiers killed, the 8 prisoners taken. But many in the 442nd believed that if Inouye had been white, he would have received the Medal of Honor. That higher decoration seemed reserved for others, not for Japanese Americans, no matter how extraordinary their valor. Inouye spent 20 months in military hospitals, learning to function with one arm, adapting to a new reality, where simple tasks required relearning. He was honorably discharged with the rank of captain in May 1947, his military career over at age 22. He returned to Hawaii uncertain about his future, but determined to make something of himself despite his disability. He enrolled at the University of Hawaii, using the GI Bill to pay for his education. He studied government and economics, developing an interest in politics and public service. His war experiences had fundamentally changed him. He had seen the worst of humanity in combat, but he had also seen the best, the courage and sacrifice of men from all backgrounds. And he had witnessed the injustice done to Japanese Americans, the contradiction of being asked to fight for freedom while your own freedom was denied. These experiences drove him toward politics. After earning his undergraduate degree, he attended George Washington University Law School, earning his law degree in 1952. He returned to Hawaii and began practicing law. But his real passion was political change. He believed that the sacrifices of Japanese American soldiers, the blood shed by the 442nd, had earned his community the right to full participation in American civic life. In 1953, Inouye was elected to Hawaii's territorial legislature. He was building a political career in what was still a U.S. territory, not yet a state, working alongside other Japanese American veterans who had returned from the war, determined to change the society that had doubted them. Then, in 1959, everything changed. Hawaii became the 50th state of the Union, and the new state needed representatives in Congress. Daniel Inouye was elected as one of Hawaii's first representatives to the U.S. House of Representatives. 3 years later, in 1962, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, where he would serve for the next 50 years, until his death in 2012. Think about that career arc for a moment. A man who had been declared an enemy alien by his own government became one of its most senior and respected legislators. A man who lost his arm fighting for America became one of the most powerful voices in shaping American policy. During his Senate career, Inouye was involved in some of the most significant political events of the late 20th century. He served on the Senate Watergate Committee that investigated the Nixon administration. He was vice chair of the Senate committee that investigated the Iran-Contra affair. He chaired the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs for years, becoming a champion for Native American rights. He was a senior member of the Appropriations Committee, controlling billions of dollars in federal spending. From 2009 until his death, he served as president pro tempore of the Senate, making him third in line for the presidency. But perhaps his most important work came in the realm of civil rights and recognition for Japanese Americans. Inouye was instrumental in the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, landmark legislation that formally apologized for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II and provided reparation payments of $20,000 to each surviving internee. The act stated plainly what many had known all along, that a grave injustice had been done, that Executive Order 9066 had been born of racial prejudice and wartime hysteria rather than military necessity. And then, in the year 2000, came the recognition that many believed was 55 years overdue. A review of military records from World War II revealed a pattern of discrimination in the awarding of medals. Japanese-American soldiers who had performed acts of extraordinary valor had been systematically denied the Medal of Honor, receiving instead the Distinguished Service Cross or other lesser decorations. It was a form of institutional racism that had persisted even in recognizing valor. On June 21, 2000, President Bill Clinton held a ceremony at the White House to correct this historical injustice. 20 Japanese-American veterans of World War II, including Daniel Inouye, received upgraded awards, their Distinguished Service Crosses converted to Medals of Honor. Inouye stood in the White House, 75 years old, his right sleeve still empty, as the president hung the Medal of Honor around his neck and read the citation for his actions on that April day in 1945. The ceremony was emotional for everyone involved. Many of the recipients had waited more than half a century for this recognition. Some had died before the review process was completed, their medals accepted by family members. For Inouye, the medal represented not just recognition of his personal valor, but acknowledgement of an entire generation that had been forced to prove its loyalty in blood. It was an admission, long overdue, that men who had been treated as suspects and outsiders had, in some of the war's darkest moments, stood among America's bravest. Daniel Inouye never spoke of his actions as heroic. When asked about that day on the ridge in Italy, he would quietly deflect the attention to his men, to the soldiers who followed him forward, who covered him with fire, who carried him down the mountain when he could no longer walk. He believed that courage was not something extraordinary, but something demanded by circumstances, and that his circumstances had simply left him no other choice. But history saw it differently. On April 21, 1945, on a rocky ridge in Tuscany, a young second lieutenant did more than destroy 3 machine gun nests. He broke a defensive line that had held up entire armies. He saved the lives of his platoon, and he embodied a truth that could no longer be ignored, that loyalty is proven by actions, not ancestry. Daniel Inouye lost his right arm that day, but he gained something far greater. He became a symbol of what America could be at its best, a nation capable of confronting its own injustice, honoring sacrifice wherever it is found, and recognizing that courage belongs to no single race, culture, or background. From a wounded young officer on a mountainside in Italy to one of the most respected leaders in the United States Senate, Inouye's life became a living answer to the question his generation had been forced to ask. Do we truly belong? His answer was written in blood, in service, and in half a century of public leadership. On that ridge, under machine gun fire and exploding grenades, Daniel Inouye proved that belonging is not granted by fear or denied by prejudice. It is earned by sacrifice, and earned, beyond all doubt, is exactly what he did.